You're up.
Finally, I'm handing the torch off on this one. They're going to be getting into the water supply discussion here, and we have our esteemed water supply manager here to walk you through it.
Good morning, Chair Kilborn, Water Commissioners. My name's Kelly Dyer. I'm the water supply manager, and I'm here to give an overview of our water supply situation. As you know, we've had recent rains, so I wanted to take some time to talk about how those have affected our strategy going forward. So first I'll give an overview of the current drought status, then discuss the supply strategy, and then discuss extraordinary conservation. So just to recap, we've been in a drought since 2012. We've experienced the 5 driest consecutive years on record. And even with the recent rains, it's important to remember that we are still in a drought. And just looking back at where we've been, in February of 2014 was when the drought started becoming serious, and we declared a stage 1 drought condition and asked for voluntary 20% extraordinary conservation. Shortly after, in the spring of 2014, we made that 20% conservation target mandatory. A year later, a stage 3 drought emergency was declared, and we increased the conservation target to 25%. A year later after that, we then increased the conservation target to 35%. And then most recently, in December of 2016, we increased the conservation target to 40% and included the lawn watering ban to achieve that target, focusing really on our peak outdoor summer water usage. This is a chart of our rainfall at Gibraltar, and you can see here's the last 5 years that we've had well below average rainfall. And here we are in 2017. We're just above average rainfall, and this little part of the bar that has hatch marks is from that February 17th very large storm event that we had. So we had almost 10 inches just in one storm event, and but for that storm, we'd still be under below average rainfall. So that was one storm event. I don't know that what will follow. I do know we have more rains coming next week, but I have not heard the projections on how many inches we'll receive from that storm yet. So has the rain helped? Yes, it has. But we're still in a drought. And so this chart on the left shows where we were at the beginning of the water year, which was an exceptional drought. And then as rains started occurring in Northern California, it really narrowed into our area. That was the only area in the state that remained in an exceptional drought. And then with our rains in February, that was changed to a severe drought. I have heard that that NOAA has changed the drought monitor for our area to say moderate in their March map. I did put a call into them because I'm not clear on why they would have changed it from severe to moderate, and their explanation on their website was related to groundwater basins. And I would like to confirm with them because as far as I'm concerned, we're still in a drought. And some of the terminology that they use can be confusing. So it's important just to know we're still in a drought. The rains have helped to fill our reservoirs, but Cachuma is only partially full, and we only expect a partial allocation. And our groundwater basins take a long time to recover, so it's not going to be one rain event to recover our groundwater basins. It's going to take several years. This is a chart of Cachuma water storage. So here we were back in 2014 when we declared stage 1. And then you can see at this point, Cachuma is right about at the same volume. Now the makeup of what's in the lake is different. We have state water in storage now. So our allocations are going to be different this time around than they were last time around. But you can see we're just about where we were when we started the journey that we've been on the last few years with the drought. And just a comparison of each of our water sources, 2014 to current. Back in 2014, we had a full allocation from Kachuma. We didn't necessarily use all of that water, but we had a full allocation. Currently, we're anticipating that the Kachuma allocation is going to be a partial allocation. This estimate assumes about a 40% allocation, but we have not heard a final report on that. We expect April 1st, the Bureau will issue the allocation for Kachuma for this year. In 2014, we had carryover. That was water that was saved from previous years and built up and stored in Kachuma. Currently, we do not have any carryover from previous years at Kachuma. Gibraltar was pretty low in 2014. It was pretty much empty. And now we have a full Gibraltar, although we don't anticipate we can use all of that water. So while we're maximizing deliveries as much as we can, it is a function of what the water quality is in Gibraltar. So we expect we can use about 3,000 acre feet through September. Our state water allocation in 2014 was 5%. That's when the whole state was in a massive drought. This year is a different story, and we've had spilling of reservoirs all across Northern California. So our state allocation is 60% at this point and could go up. In terms of water stored in the state water system, we have a little bit more water that's accessible to us in storage in the state water system. And if you add up all the numbers, it's relatively the same. It's slightly less in 2017 compared to 2014, with the exception of the groundwater basin. So back in 2014, we had pretty much a full groundwater basin. Our downtown basin was completely full, and Foothill was in good shape as well. But now we're approaching historic lows and have only about 30% of the estimated yield remaining from those basins. That estimated yield is based on modeling by USGS. They have a detailed numerical groundwater model that's used for planning purposes. And we also have an extensive monitoring program of water levels and water quality that's used to feed into that model and calibrate it.
Question regarding the state water storage. Is that in Oroville or in San Luis?
Chair Kilbourne, Commissioner Keller, that would be in San Luis Reservoir. Those numbers reflect San Luis. We also have some water in 2014 we had some water in Dudley Ridge, but it wasn't accessible to us, so I didn't include it in these numbers. So I wanted to share with you some of the data that we have from our monitoring program with USGS, and we have just about 60 wells that we monitor groundwater levels. So I didn't, these are just a few that are representative of the conditions in the basin. So down at the bottom is our historical pumping, and the red is city pumping, and the green would be pumping by others. We collect data from La Cumbra Municipal Water Company to add to this chart. And here is the last drought. This is a few wells, the water levels at a few wells. And then you can see after the last drought, it took about 10 years before the basin's fully recovered, and the city did very little pumping during that 10-year period. Here we are today. So our water levels are comparable, maybe slightly lower than where they were in the last drought. But we still anticipate that we could produce another 30% of the remaining yield from the basin available to the city. This is our water levels in Storage Unit 1. So the city is the only known major pumper in Storage Unit 1. And this blip on this side of the chart is the last drought. And these are, on the left-hand side is our upper producing zone, and then on the right side is the lower producing zone. There's a consolidating layer that separates the two water producing zones in the basin. So they're not really hydraulically connected, which is why we have two charts. But after the last drought, the city stopped pumping, allowed the basins to rest, and they recovered within about 5 years. And so here we are today, and we're approaching, we're not quite where we were in the last drought, but we're starting to approach it. One of the main concerns with Storage Unit 1 is seawater intrusion. And we have a network of monitoring wells to measure chlorides in the basin. And I'm going to go through a few of them at different locations. Here's the 101. And what we're looking at right now are the monitoring wells right at the coast. And so we would expect some level of seawater intrusion at these wells since they are located so close to the coastline. And on the right, this is the chloride concentrations in the last drought, so there was definitely some seawater intrusion. And then it started to drop off over the years, and now here we are again where the seawater intrusion has started to increase. This next well is our indicator well, where once we start to see chlorides increasing at this well, we increase our sampling program. We'll take more frequent samples, and we'll also add the number of wells we're sampling for chlorides. So here, this was the last drought, the chloride levels. And then just before we went into the current drought, the chloride concentrations had just about gone away, and now here we are again with some increases in chlorides. And then finally, this is our well that's over by the 101, and this is an area where we really don't, this is our buffer line where once we start to see chlorides at this point, we'd consider shutting down our wells because we don't want it getting any closer to where our production wells are. And I should have been discussing the scale on these charts, but this is less than 50 milligrams per liter. If I can, my eyes aren't very good. I guess it says 80 milligrams per liter. So, and there haven't been any real substantial changes at this well. So at this point, we don't see that seawater intrusion is occurring that far into the basin.
The top here is like 4,500, and the top on the other one was 80.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
The axis is different, so I apologize I didn't point that out earlier. These are in the thousands, so yeah, 4,500 milligrams per liter at this well.
Are these wells in the upper zone?
It's a combination of both. We sample both the upper and lower zone, and I'd have to check which one specifically we're looking at. This one does say 23E5 is, I can't read it. It does say it at the top of the chart, but I can't read how deep it is. I think it says 800 feet, roughly. But we do sample from both zones.
Thanks.
So those charts are all numbers. Is there a number that you use that's trouble, or is it more art than science? You just say, oh, this is on a trend up, and you just have a feeling on when you got to stop this?
When there's a trend going up, we know there's seawater intrusion that's occurring. The concentrations are a function of how much fresh water is mixing with the seawater. So I believe the ocean water is about 30,000 milligrams per liter, and anything that's over 1,000 we're not going to be able to use that for drinkable water.
Okay. And then how does sea level rise affect this whole process? Or do you follow that? So as sea level goes up an inch, wouldn't that also then just I use my terms, but from a pressure standpoint, just allow then more intrusion by nature because you have a greater volume pushing against the coast, and that would affect these numbers too over decades of time?
It could.
Okay.
Typically, when our basins are full, the gradient is to push water out towards the ocean. But right now, some of our wells are seeing that the hydraulic level is less than the seawater level, and that's why the seawater's coming in.
Theory, what a full basin or what a certain level of basin would help keep seawater out decades ago, that same level of basin might not have the same positive effect in the future.
I just want to add to this. I thought this was kind of fascinating take a look at the scale here. I know it's hard to read, but the 0 is the surface elevation. This is the well monitoring, and you can see that the water level is above the surface, which is because, and we've talked about this before, we have in the lower area artesianing wells. This pressure here is what's critical to pushing out that seawater. So if the ocean rises an inch, I don't know that it will exacerbate the situation during a drought, but during a normal situation where we're managing the basin and there's a positive pressure in the basin, it shouldn't have a significant impact.
Correct. I think it would have, and so this is, under normal circumstances, these water levels are almost 50 feet above seawater level, so we would have to have a substantial increase in seawater levels in order to reverse the flow. Okay, and so something else that's different than 2014 is now we have desal coming online. It's another local supply of drinking water. Previously, groundwater was our only truly local water source where if something happened with our tunnels that would interrupt our surface water deliveries, groundwater was our only local drinking source. Now we also have desal online. It's one important part of a diverse water supply portfolio, and in our long-term water supply plan, the policy was to use it as a drought water supply. We will be reconsidering the long-term role of desal when the drought emergency ends and when the drought impacts end, so when our groundwater supplies recover, as we do expect the impacts of this drought to last quite a few years, and desal will have a role in helping to recover from those impacts. So our desalination project was first approved for construction in July of 2015, and construction has been completed in less than 2 years. All major construction is now complete, and we are now in the testing phase. So that's a major milestone in that we're now in the testing phase and hope to bring it online in the coming months. So just as in summary, the drought is not over for us. Kachuma is at 2014 levels when the drought first became serious, and we are going to continue to plan as though the next couple of years are dry. We don't know if this current rainy year will be followed by a dry spell, so we want to plan for that case in case that is the way it goes. And again, the drought impacts last for several years. It'll take 5 to 10 years for our groundwater basins to fully recover. So now into our supply strategy. We are planning for a three-year look ahead for the next 3 years, assuming this year is followed by 2 dry years. And impacts from the recent rains, we now have a full Gibraltar, and we do anticipate a partial allocation from Kachuma. Some key messages I wanted to get across regarding how that has changed our strategy. It allowed us to postpone any decisions on expanding desal, which would have been to address any shortages in 2019. We've now been able to fill that gap. And it also has allowed us to rest our groundwater basin. So at this point, all of the wells in the Foothill Basin have been shut down, and we have turned down Ortega Groundwater Treatment Plant and Storage Unit 1 as far as it can go, and are working to prepare it for shutdown for an extended period. We will continue with producing desal at the 3125 acre feet per year, and we will need to continue with some level of extraordinary conservation. This is our current proposed water supply strategy. And so starting from the bottom, the purple is our recycled water, and we're currently in year 2017, which is third from the right. The dark blue bar is Kachuma, and we had used some of our Kachuma water at the beginning of the water year, which started in October. We had 3 months of Kachuma water before it was totally exhausted by December, so that's what's reflected here. We're now shifting to use our Gibraltar water and try to maximize that supply. This yellow bar is our groundwater that we've already produced in the basin, but now we'll be shutting that down. And then orange is our imported water, and green is desal. So looking ahead to next year, we expect that all of the Gibraltar water will be used by the end of this water year. And any Kachuma allocations that we receive for this year, we're going to hold on to and plan to use for next year's water supply. You can see we are not planning to operate our groundwater wells next year. We will be letting the basins rest, and we'll have desal at full production. And then as our surface, assuming 2 more dry years, as our surface water becomes diminished, we'll be bringing the groundwater back online as necessary. This supply strategy assumes a 30% conservation target going forward. And you can see there is a small gap in 2019, although we feel comfortable that we can fill that gap. We do have capacity in the state water system to bring in more water. At this point, our state water projections assume a 35% allocation and no additional water purchases. And so most likely we can fill that gap either with a larger state water allocation or water purchases as needed. I would caution with relying on the short-term water purchases that going forward. Those are something that we've been really successful with in the current drought, and CCWA has done a wonderful job in finding opportunities and finding agreements for supplemental water. However, DWR is starting to crack down on that, I would say, and so they're changing some of their Our agreements really push the boundaries of the state water project, and we're in some cases what we would call state-of-the-art agreements, and had pushed some of the exchanges that are required. So DWR is now saying that if you purchase supplemental water, you can no longer carry it over to the next year, which really changes everything, makes it almost impossible to do these short-term agreements. We normally, in April, find out if an agency will have water that they want to sell. And then by the time you get the agreements in place, it's summer or fall before they start delivery. Well, if you're getting your water delivered by, say, the fall, you have to use it all before December, because when December comes around, you're going to lose it at this point with the new this is somewhat of a new policy that DWR has decided to move forward with. And so I'm not certain that these supplemental water purchases are going to be as easy as they were in this last drought. We also have about 6,000 acre feet of water debt that we have to pay off, and I would caution against increasing that debt any further.
I was going to ask, where does the water we have with MWD fall? Would that be used to offset our water debt, or does it fall into this chart somewhere?
That's a good question, Chair Kilburn. We have water with Metropolitan that we'll have to take delivery of this year, so that's going to be delivered to Kachuma before December. Because we're taking that water, we can offset and not use our Table A normal state water allocation. And so we're going to be looking to use our Table A allocation to pay back some of our water debt later this year. So if it will all depend on whether there's capacity in the system. Since there's so much water flowing, a lot of agencies don't have capacity to take the water back from us.
So that paints a appropriately pessimistic picture, but so I just have a couple questions. And if we had a relatively normal water year next year, in 2018, you would see the Gibraltar come back into play, right? And that would then, you would then make a call on which one of those other bars to reduce, right?
Correct, Chair Kilborn, Commissioner Jordan. If next year has substantial rains, we would reassess all of this and reassess our conservation targets, because it would be wonderful to have additional Gibraltar supply, and that would change our outlook. We wouldn't relax the drought declaration
Right.
until Kachuma is almost full or spilling. Kachuma is really the best indicator that you can see for where we are in the drought.
And then on your previous slide, you said you were delaying an expansion decision on desal, but you'd paint, if we still had, if that was the picture for the next 2 years, and you paint such a terrible picture on water purchases, at what point can you make a decision on desal to increase desal and be ready for 2019 to increase capacity there, rather than rely on something that seems the landscape might be changing and you can't actually get as much? It's almost 4 million acre feet, right? 3 or 4 million acre feet for the state water and water purchases.
Yes, that's a good question.
Next module would be 2,500 or 3,000 acre feet for desal.
2,500.
1,250 acre-foot increments
The
is,
two, to take 2 modules basically.
Right.
So I guess what would be, when would you set, how long would it take once you said go on increasing desal to accomplish that?
well, what we were looking at to increase the size of the treatment capacity, it's a year.
Okay.
The other component is the conveyance capacity, which is probably more on the order of 18 months to do the conveyance capacity.
So there's a point here in the current year and the next 2 years that you either have to see something and you get to see some stuff, but you don't get to see other cards that are still being put face down on the table, right?
Right, and I think for assuming this worst case scenario, the other component that we could exercise again is more conservation again if we needed to go there. But I think what this kind of strikes a balance. This isn't a worst case scenario and this isn't the best case scenario, but kind of a middle of the road option here. And I think next year, after next year's rainfall, we will again visit this. Okay, what does it look like? What do we need going forward? I think we've been somewhat conservative on our state water. And to go from a year like this to 35%, I think we should get at least 50 next year, given how much water's in the system. But then again, you have Orville situations, which you could really, something like that were to happen anywhere along the system, you could disrupt, those deliveries. And so I think we've tried to strike that balance with this. But until Kachuma gets close to spilling, I think this discussion of next year, do we need to start thinking about expansion of desal again, and we'll come up again.
And then what discussion have you had on, if this actually plays out this way, on not pursuing expansion of desal now, but saying in 2 years you'd rely on going back to 1.5 million acre feet of groundwater, rather than continuing to let those rest?
Well, and the amount of groundwater that's shown in this chart is about the remaining estimated yield. So unless so that yellow bar coming back online in 2019 is pretty close to the remaining yield in the groundwater basins.
The end of your options there is what you're saying. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so conservation, as mentioned, our current conservation target is 40%, extraordinary conservation. That was put in place in December and was intended to address our projected summer of 2017 water shortages during our peak demand periods. And part of that was to adopt a lawn watering ban, which was a preventative measure in case the rains were not sufficient. The recent rains have alleviated those peaking issues, but we are still in a drought. And so our recommendation is to revise the conservation target from 40% to 30%. 30%, you will recall in 2014 where we were at 25%, so it's just a little bit higher target than when we were in 2014, considering the status of our groundwater basins. And our summer peaking issue has ceased, and 30% we believe is sufficient based on our 3-year projections of water supply. So our current water use regulations that we have in place for the drought, I'm just going to go through these briefly, where watering is limited to evening and early morning hours. Watering during or 48 hours after rainfall is prohibited. Runoff or overspray is prohibited. Hoses must be used with a shutoff nozzle. Commercial fountains over 25 square feet may not operate. No washing of pavement and other hard surfaces. Pools and spas must be covered when not in use. Drought notices are required in lodging, restaurants, and gyms. Water served only upon request, and watering lawns with potable water is prohibited. And our recommendation is to keep all of the current water use regulations except for the mandatory lawn ban, since the summer peaking issue has subsided, but maintain the policy to strongly encourage letting lawns go on a voluntary basis. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Madeline Ward, our water conservation supervisor, to talk briefly about some of the programs in the water conservation.
Chair Kilborn, members of the commission, the city, as always, is here to help our water customers save water, whether we're in a drought or not. One of our most popular programs that I like to highlight is our free water checkup program, and this is available for both homes or businesses, schools, industrial complexes. Whoever you are, we're happy to come out and help you evaluate water use inside and out and provide recommendations and information on rebates and programs. We have a variety of other programs available, some for do-it-yourselfers and some for people that want to hire professional help. We have a landscape rebate for replacing existing high water use plants and or irrigation systems. We have a rebate on high efficiency washing machines, so that's replacing those old top loaders that use about 35 gallons per load with the new efficient front loaders that use about 8 to 10 gallons per load. We have a rebate for pool covers. We have a free sprinkler nozzle program to replace the generic pop-up misting spray heads with ones that deliver water at a low precipitation rate. We provide free mulch deliveries of the county mulch for water customers twice per year, and we have free rain shutoff sensors. I like to highlight a couple properties that show before and after photos with our landscape rebate program. The top picture is the Santa Barbara Association of Realtors, which is also a rainwater demonstration garden on Chapala Street, right next to Mitchell Terrena. If you haven't been there before, if you're driving by, I encourage you to stop and take a look. We have great signage there that demonstrates how the rainwater is redirected into the front yard. The previous lawn that you can see on the left, they used to water that about 3 times a week. And the current rain garden, they water 3 times a year. So we have significant savings there, plus it adds a lot of beauty and color and dimension to the garden. This is also a great slide. This was a study that was done by Santa Monica College where they compared 2 different landscapes side by side for going on 5 years now. It's a traditional landscape with hedges and lawn, and a sustainable landscape with waterways, plants, and mulch and drip irrigation. So not only is it significant water savings, but as you can see, there's significant savings in terms of yard waste that's produced, and of course, maintenance hours. You don't need to mow sustainable landscapes. They generally just need a little nip and tuck about once a year.
So with regard to next steps, just to recap, our water conservation target is used to estimate projected water use. So as we revise our water conservation target, we need to factor that into our next year's water rates for FY18, since those revenues are a function of how much water is used. And we will continue to monitor our supplies and demands with monthly drought updates to Water Commission and Council. There are some rains coming next week, so everything I said today could change, but we don't know. So we'll continue to monitor this closely, since our supplies are pretty dynamic when we have changing surface water conditions. So our recommendation, we'd like Water Commission to recommend to Council that they adopt a resolution establishing a revised 30% conservation target and updated water use regulations effective during the Stage 3 drought. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
I think that coming back to 30% is fine, especially where we're at. That lawn watering ban was pretty hard fought, and I'll be honest, I'm not sure I want to walk it back yet. I think what we've been doing and what we did over the winter was great, where we said, hey, we'd like you to stop watering your lawns. If we don't hit our conservation goals, we'll enforce it. If we do, we won't. I don't see why we can't leave it in place with 30% and just keep that as a policy for the city, that potable water and lawns don't necessarily work together. So I guess that's a personal opinion. I don't know if anybody else is on the same page. And then just in terms of revenue projections, we've been pretty steady at about 35% conservation for quite a few years. I'm not sure what will happen if we go back to 30%, but I know I'm not really going to change anything if I see that. So for revenue projections, we might just want to consider thinking that the community is going to keep at 35% conservation, even though we say they can do 30%, just because I don't want to say, 30%, assume everybody goes to 30, then all of a sudden we've got this huge revenue shortfall. So those are my two thoughts on that.
I would totally agree with the lawn ban staying on too. You in fact post contradictory exhibits up there when it's on. When you show your supply slide for this year and the next couple years as being what I call appropriately careful and pessimistic, but then you roll that back on your recommendation to say, well, let's start watering our lawns again with that water that's on that potential supply slide. On that slide there's not an excess amount of water to be found. In fact, the last one actually had a gap, had a red part at the top of it. So I just, until you're actually rolling in excess water, I think we've clearly already done the legwork to make the disconnect between use of potable water and just yardscape as a green lawn as a normal. I think that message needs to stay.
Well, I'll say a lot of the questions I get is that was the main point of contention about the new regulations. Nobody seemed to care about the 40%. That was what it was, but they want to know, when can we water our lawns again? And I'm not saying I necessarily agree with having everyone go out and make their lawns lush again, but I think when you put that stipulation on them, I don't know, I guess puts them on a fence. So I like the idea of just making it voluntary still, just because when we did this in the past, when we went to 30%, 35%, it was still voluntary, and we still got a lot of participation in that. Like me being one of them, I stopped watering my lawn years ago, and I'm not going to go back to watering it now that we've got more water in Kachuma, but I think the flexibility gives people some, I don't know, it puts them at ease a little bit without like jamming it down their throats if they can't water their lawn. I think you're going to get pushback, I guess, is maybe what I'm saying.
Mr. Chairman, after what we're now calling the last drought, the previous usage went from about 16,000 acre feet per year to something like 14,000 afterwards, which would be something around 15% reduction right there. So what these percent numbers, I guess we're comparing this to 2014 right now, but if that experience repeats itself, even if you cut off all restrictions and clear the drought completely over, the usage will not rebound to what it was in 2014. So at some point, we may need to redefine what these percentage numbers are actually telling us.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, I just wanted one of the things that we tried to strike a balance here is also understanding drought fatigue and understanding that, you know, there may come a time when we need to ask the community to step up again and do more. But recognizing when we've been doing that now for the last three to 4 years, things have improved somewhat. In particular, the peaking issue that we were concerned about this summer has alleviated. And wanting to try and strike that balance, you know, I think certainly asking for voluntary, you know, lawn watering restrictions, or I guess asking people, continuing to ask the community not to water their lawns, I think is completely appropriate. But what we've tried to do is kind of balance that situation, because, you know, certainly as you all know, there are vulnerabilities out there, and if we were to run across something, we could very well be back and asking for the community to do more, and that certainly is something that we would go after again. And so I think in order for our request for conservation to have an impact, we also need to be willing, when things do, to kind of step back a little bit from some of those, so that when we know we need to push that button again, it's there, and we can go to the community and we have their trust on that issue. So we've tried to strike that balance here, and we appreciate your feedback. Everything you're talking about is exactly kind of the discussions we've been wrestling internally with. So I think it's been very helpful.
So just for me, I think the phrase you use, drought fatigue, is part of the problem of the messaging in terms of watering ornamental turf grass lawns. The messaging should be moving past that's not part of the drought fatigue dynamic. It's the same as, do I get in the car and drive everywhere 3 blocks, or do I walk sometimes now, or do I bike? That's what, fossil fuel fatigue, and you're going to give that back to me too, that I can get in the. I mean, it's just, it should become not an issue of drought fatigue, and we'll give you some relief, and then we'll ask for it back. It should just be a best practice going forward. I mean, I don't know. Maybe we're not ready for that. Maybe you don't want to fight that battle. Maybe we don't want to fight that battle. But I think eventually you have to. I think we need to take that component, the watering of ornamental turf grass lawn with potable water, out of that dynamic of it's a drought relief give and take back for people. So I mean, that when that happens, I don't know. If it's not going to happen now, I don't care. But you'll hear this again the more we talk about it in the future.
That's good.
Well, and, I mean, I completely agree with you. And again, I don't think it should be voluntary. I think the 30% conservation needs to be hit. And what we said before, and I think this was very powerful, is, hey, you know, with the 40%, if the 40%'s hit, we don't necessarily need to enforce all of these rules, because the community is really doing what that we're asking them to do. Same thing here. If the community's hitting 30%, we don't necessarily need to go out and enforce these lawn watering bans, because the community is doing a great job self-enforcing, essentially. But that we leave it in place so that we have this new normal of ornamental turf is not a place to use potable water.
Chair Kilburn, Commissioner Burney, if we have a rule on the books, I think we are obligated to enforce it. I guess one of the thoughts I'm having is if we have it as a rule, it is going to reduce our water use, and I think we'll be beyond the 30% conservation, which I would like for our target to reflect the water use we expect with the rules we have in place, since that feeds into our water rates. And so I don't really see us having a 30% conservation and keeping the lawn ban. The lawn ban was put in place when we were achieving a 35% and needed to go to 40. So I really see it as more of a aligned with the 40% conservation target. But my understanding with regard to rules is we don't really have the flexibility of not enforcing it. If it's a rule, we have to be out there enforcing it.
You
I
know,
don't think our messaging changes at all, though. We've done a great job of getting people thinking along the lines of, I'm going to get rid of my lawn. I don't want to have to deal with this at all, having to like think about watering it. So I don't think that changes. It's just, yeah, I don't know. I think making it voluntary seems prudent at this point.
it's not going to change our messaging to replace your lawn, and it's certainly we're going to continue to push that effort.
It's not going to change your messaging, but that's what everybody's going to report as soon as the day after I don't know when this is going to the city council, but that's what's going to be reported, is that you don't have to, there's watering is back. That's going to be the headline. I mean, because nothing else is really changing. And then to Ms. Dyer, your point about the matching conservation and the rates, if that's true, if the only thing that's going away is the lawn watering ban, then we probably should have a 35% conservation goal, not a 30%, if that's what we expect, because that's where we were at before. So I guess, and that was kind of my point about what we do with the rates and being careful about what we do with the rates, since we were at 35% very standard. And if that's the only thing that we're taking back, then we probably should go back to a 35% conservation goal.
So we did discuss that in length too, about going back just to 35, and what we did have seen out in the community and wanted to try and hopefully hit home is that there are our urban forests, our trees have been suffering, and wanting to kind of also send a message that we do have water for you to water those trees. And I think at 35% conservation, people weren't watering their trees, and so wanting to get, I think we have room for that now. Reasonable, prudent watering of trees is appropriate, and I think we want to try and say that send that message that's available. And I think maybe that should be part of the messaging and as we go forward, because you're right, that's going to pick up as you can water your lawn again.
And what does that 5% between 30 and 35% generate in revenues? I mean, that's several $1 million worth of revenues right there, right? Which we need for infrastructure, so. All a balance, I guess.
Well, and I think the conservation number, you guys appreciate this as well. It is somewhat arbitrary. We're setting it. It is intended to try and illustrate, here's where we're going, and I think it's either a yes, we're meeting, or yes, we're not. But I don't think it isn't really set up that someone can go home and look at their bill and look at that 30%, because it's dependent on where you started at. So in some ways it's kind of arbitrary, but it's a way for us internally to kind of manage the health of our goal where we are.
Right, and I think what we've always, we've set our target based on what are the status of our water supplies. And so we think we have sufficient water supplies where if we need a 30% mandatory conservation. If the community is not meeting that with the regulations we have in place, that's when we talk about coming back and making them stronger and adding additional regulations. And this might be a wait and see kind of a thing where if we set the target at 30%, we monitor whether that's being met. If it's not being met, we've got to do something more with regulations. And our water rates are it's still something that's going to be reflected in our water rates, which are also structured based on conservation principles.
So you're looking for a recommendation, but this agenda report's already in the system. In fact, going to be out public today, so it's already been vetted. So I'd offer a motion that recommends approval of your report today with the note too that the commission had comments that differed from your recommendation on stopping the ban on ornamental lawn watering, and a couple members at least were concerned that that was the wrong thing to do.
I'd second that.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Yes, we'll take a vote on that. Does that motion fly? Does that work? Okay. All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. So we'll move on to the last item, the Water Resources Manager's Report. Mr.
Okay, I
Hagmark.
wanted to go over a few things. One of the things I wanted to provide an update is we are working with the Bureau and the county to try and establish an allocation this year. The Bureau is wanting to establish something by April 1st, and they told us that isn't a joke. So we appreciate their urgency of trying to establish something. What they would like to do is establish an allocation April 1st, and then another one October 1st. So we're working actively with the other member units and them to kind of try and establish something. And at this point,
This is subject to change, but the latest estimates are about a 40% allocation. So we continue to work with the Bureau, but that's the latest projections I've seen at this point, subject to change.
roughly that's. I did want to highlight and emphasize again February 17th, just to kind of put all of this in perspective, because I wanted, it was such an enormous rain event on that Friday, in the sense it was a 25-year rain event. We received over 10 inches of rain in 24 hours. And aside from that rain event, that's really what just makes this winter any different than the last four that we've seen. And just kind of, I think, puts in perspective still how vulnerable we are here and why we need to continue to diversify our supplies, as I think you all well know, but I think it's important to remind us just how close things still are and were going into that. I mean, the reservoir went from basically, I think it was like 17% of capacity on February 16th to 20 or 47% of capacity now as a result of that one rain event. So it really is tight, and it's, as much as I'd like to say things have improved out there, I don't know that we've really seen an improvement, but got lucky.
You're killing me. You're just making me feel like my motion was too polite, okay?
It was moisture. It did collect, and we do have it in our reservoirs. I think the other point that needs to be said, and I think this is why we kind of have carefully been considering this the conservation target, is to think about how much water is wrapped up in that conservation target. I mean, when we were hitting 35% as we are, it has been generating 4 to 4.5 thousand, basically a full Gibraltar's worth of water every year. I mean, it's a significant amount of water this community's been saving. It's impressive. I mean, when I am able to go and speak to other agencies, particularly in Ventura County, it's pretty astonishing what this community's been able to do. So, I'm really, really proud of our community. Another item that we saw come forward was a request for letter of support on AB 574. I think I got that number right. This is legislation in support of a timeline for DPR regulations, and furthermore to try and change the terminology. The the push is to get away from this designation of DPR, IPR, wanting to kind of talk about it as potable reuse. And then there's various forms of potable reuse, one being groundwater augmentation, injection, surface water augmentation of the groundwater, and then raw water augmentation or surface water reservoirs. So these designations being more appropriate than saying direct potable reuse, because nowhere in this discussion are we talking about putting advanced treated wastewater in directly into the water system. That no one is contemplating that right now, and so the direct potable reuse kind of implies that that is part of the dialogue right now. So that is not. I think that's moving forward. So we are putting together a letter of support, and our current legislative platform supports that. We have some pretty strong language in there right now on potable reuse. So we're trying to get a letter put together for Helene to sign and send of support. So we will continue to track that and bring back more information on that as we move forward. Do you have anything more to add to that? Okay. So just looking at our water, one of the things that we are we're in kind of flux here. You're seeing the change in our supplies. You'll certainly see, looking at Devil's Canyon, we haven't seen that tick up in a while. We got 70 acre feet in February out of Devil's Canyon. Again, that's typically a pretty high quality water. We're able to tap in early on when Gibraltar is still settling out, typically. But at this time, we are pulling. What you will see starting March 1st is that we've been pulling significantly from Gibraltar. The water quality there has improved dramatically. It's still a challenging water source with the TOC that's in it, but it's treatable at this point. So we're bringing that water down at the maximum we can pull on it. Mm-hmm. You'll notice that our groundwater production, we're starting to pull back on that. Typically that's because it was a wet year, but now we've started to shut down wells to go with that. And then wanted to highlight recycled water demand has really dropped off substantially. And again, that's because there's an abundant free water falling from the sky. The next picture here is up also on the screen. This is the 12-month running average water demand. And just wanted to point out here that we've actually gotten to that point that we were at our lowest during the last major drought in the early 90s. And I think that speaks volumes to the community getting there without, really major restrictions.
If I could I've got the chart up on the screen as well, and this was 1991 right here when there was the March miracle that increased storage in Kachuma, but it didn't spill. So it's kind of a similar situation in terms of Kachuma storage as where we were in 1991. And you can see the demands remained flat for about the next year. And then in 1992 is when Kachuma spilled. And that's when demand started increasing. And so this would be about we're achieving a 35% conservation from 2013 demands. And then a year after Kachuma spilled, it had gone to where it would be a 25% conservation level. But then it continued to slowly increase for the next 5 years or so. But as Commissioner Keller was saying, never really reached where it was before the drought. And I would expect that kind of a pattern to occur again.
Mr. Chairman, on this, to me, it would be useful to put lines for those percentage amounts. I mean, what does 30% or 40% look compared to that red line? You're saying the red line basically is 35%?
35, from where we were before the current drought.
Which is sort of the line of little crosses up there.
It'd be our 35% reduction is measured against our 2013 demands, which was that was what the state's metric was. And so here's 2013 approximately.
Right, so I'm saying that would be zero if we're going to put reductions there. The zero, and the red line is 30 or 35 or something. But in fact, do we calculate this on a monthly basis?
Correct. This is a rolling 12-month average.
Right. But in terms of the goals, are we reevaluating those monthly, or is that just as we're going to meet the whole year's goal?
I think it changes from month to month. So in the summertime is when we have more discretionary water use. So if we had a goal of 30%, I would expect that to be a little bit higher in the summer and a little bit lower in the winter. So really it's for the year that we are, that we need to meet the target on a yearly basis, but we would monitor it on a monthly basis to see if we were really off target from meeting it before the year end.
So in the next sheet in your packet, we talk about the GPCD, and I just wanted to point out a few things on there. Is the residential GPCD, which is what we report to the state, in that the community has just got a new low as far as gallons per capita per day at 40 gallons per capita per day, which is really quite astonishing. Keeping in mind that I think the state a while back has established 55 gallons per capita per day as kind of a